Behind the massive walls of the Vatican lie manuscripts that no living person can read, texts in languages that cannot be deciphered, even by artificial intelligence. Scientists who tried to study them lost their access and their careers. Sources inside the Vatican claim that revealing the contents could cause a massive spiritual crisis. What do these silent pages hide? An alternative history of Christianity? Forbidden rituals? Prophecies about the end of time? Today, we will try to lift the veil on one of humanity's greatest mysteries. If you are interested in the mysteries of history and the riddles of the past, subscribe to our channel and like this video. Now here's a question for discussion. Do you think the Vatican has the right to hide these manuscripts from humanity? Or should all knowledge be available to everyone, regardless of the possible consequences? Share your opinion in the comments. In the heart of Rome, behind the massive walls of the Vatican, lies one of the most mysterious places on the planet. The secret archives of the Holy See hold documents that could overturn our understanding of history and faith. Among the endless corridors and halls filled with ancient folios are manuscripts that no living person can read. These texts are written in languages that even the most outstanding linguists of our time cannot decipher. The Vatican archives occupy more than 85 kilometers of shelving. They contain documents covering more than 1,200 years of Catholic Church history. However, there is a special section to which even the highest church hierarchs have limited access. It is there, in special climate-controlled chambers under round-the-clock security, that manuscripts in unknown languages are kept. The first mentions of the existence of such documents appeared as early as the 16th century, when Pope Paul III ordered the collection of all unusual texts found in monasteries and churches throughout the Christian world. Officially, this was done to preserve cultural heritage, but insiders claim that the real goal was to remove potentially dangerous knowledge from public access. What makes these manuscripts so special? First of all, their language does not correspond to any known language family. Linguists have found that the graphemes of these texts bear similarities to ancient Middle Eastern scripts, but their structure and grammar are completely different from anything ever documented. Some researchers suggest that they may be remnants of languages from extinct civilizations that existed long before the first cultures known to us. The appearance of the manuscripts also raises many questions. They are written on papyrus and parchment of unusual quality, which cannot be accurately dated using modern methods. The ink has a unique composition, including components whose origin remains a mystery. The illustrations in some manuscripts depict symbols and figures not found in traditional Christian iconography. The church authorities have not officially commented on the existence of these documents. Requests from scientists and journalists are met with a standard response that all archive materials are in the process of being cataloged and systematized. However, sources within the Vatican claim that work on the mysterious manuscripts is being carried out in strict secrecy by a special group of experts who have taken a vow of silence. Attempts by independent researchers to gain access to these texts invariably end in refusal. Even world-renowned scholars, specializing in ancient languages and the deciphering of historical documents, receive polite but categorical refusals. Moreover, there are known cases where researchers who were too persistent in their interest in the subject were subjected to professional ostracism and deprived of funding for their projects. There are several theories as to why the Vatican guards these manuscripts so carefully. The most common version is that the texts contain alternative versions of religious events that could undermine the foundations of Christian dogma. Another theory suggests that the manuscripts describe ancient mystical practices and rituals that the Church considers dangerous to the spiritual health of believers. Several years ago, one of the archivists, who wished to remain anonymous, told reporters that he had seen fragments of translations of some of the manuscripts. According to him, the texts contained descriptions of cosmological ideas that differed radically from the biblical view of the universe. They spoke of the multiplicity of worlds, the cyclical nature of time, and the knowledge possessed by humanity in prehistoric times. But why should this knowledge remain a secret? The Vatican claims that it is protecting the faith of billions of people from information that could be misinterpreted. Critics, however, believe that the Church is afraid of losing control over the religious narrative, and admitting that the history of Christianity may have more complex and ambiguous roots than is commonly believed. What do these mysterious pages really hide? And is the world ready to learn the truth about its past? In the heart of Rome, behind the massive walls of the Vatican, lies one of the most mysterious places on the planet. The secret archives of the Holy See contain documents that could overturn our understanding of history and faith. Among the endless corridors and halls filled with ancient folios are manuscripts that no living person can read. The Vatican archives occupy more than 85 kilometers of shelving. They contain documents covering more than 1,200 years of Catholic Church history. However, there is a special section to which even the highest church hierarchs have limited access. It is there, in special climate-controlled chambers under round-the-clock security, that manuscripts in unknown languages are kept. The first mentions of the existence of such documents appeared as early as the 16th century, when Pope Paul III ordered all unusual texts to be collected. Officially, this was done to preserve cultural heritage, but insiders claim that the real goal was to remove potentially dangerous knowledge from public access. What makes these manuscripts so special? Their language does not correspond to any known language family. Linguists have found that the graphemes of these texts are similar to ancient Middle Eastern scripts, but their structure is completely different from anything documented. Some researchers suggest that these may be remnants of languages from extinct civilizations. The appearance of the manuscripts also raises questions. They are written on papyrus of unusual quality, which cannot be accurately dated. The ink has a unique composition, the origin of which remains a mystery. The illustrations depict symbols and figures not found in traditional Christian iconography. Church authorities have not officially commented on the existence of these documents. Scientists' inquiries are met with a standard response about cataloging. However, sources within the Vatican claim that the work is being carried out in strict secrecy by a group of experts who have taken a vow of silence. Attempts by independent researchers to gain access are invariably denied. Even world-renowned scholars receive categorical negative responses. There are known cases where overly persistent researchers have been professionally ostracized and deprived of funding. There are several theories as to why the Vatican guards these manuscripts so closely. The most common version is that the texts contain alternative versions of religious events. Another theory suggests descriptions of ancient mystical practices that the Church considers dangerous. A few years ago, one of the archivists said he had seen fragments of translations. According to him, the texts contained descriptions of cosmological ideas that differed radically from the biblical picture. They spoke of the multiplicity of worlds and the knowledge of prehistoric eras. What do these pages hide? And is the world ready to learn the truth? The history of the Vatican archives begins in the 4th century, when the first Christian popes began collecting documents of the nascent Church. However, the real systematization of the repositories began only in the 16th century under Pope Paul V. It was then that the decision was made to create a closed collection of documents, accessible only to a narrow circle of initiates. The archives were moved and reorganized several times. During the Napoleonic Wars, a significant part of the documents was taken to France, and not all of them were returned. This story gave rise to many legends about lost manuscripts that allegedly ended up in the private collections of European aristocrats and secret societies. The modern archive building was constructed in the 19th century, but its underground section goes much deeper. It is said that there are levels that are not marked on any official diagram. It is there, according to rumors, that the most dangerous documents are kept. Archive employees talk about sealed doors that have not been opened for decades. The procedure for gaining access to the archives is extremely complicated. Researchers must submit a written justification for their request, recommendations from recognized scholars and church leaders, and undergo a security check by the Vatican. But even after receiving permission, there are documents that cannot be accessed under any circumstances. The archive catalog consists of more than 650 volumes, but many documents have not yet been entered into public registers. Archive staff have been working on cataloging the collections for several centuries, and there is no end in sight. Some researchers suspect that some of the documents are deliberately not cataloged so that no one will find out about them. Of particular interest is the collection codenamed Department of Unidentified Texts. Officially, it includes documents whose authorship and origin could not be established. However, insiders claim that this is where manuscripts in unknown languages are concentrated. Only a few people have access to this department, and their identities are kept strictly confidential. In 1988, Pope John Paul II issued a decree, partially opening the archives to researchers. This decision was met with enthusiasm by the scientific community. However, it soon became clear that the opening was very limited. The most interesting documents remained inaccessible. There is a special commission that decides which materials can be declassified. The criteria for its work are unknown, and its decisions are not subject to appeal. Researchers note that the commission is particularly strict with requests concerning ancient manuscripts of religious content and documents related to alternative Christian teachings. The archives are guarded by the Swiss Guard and a special unit of the Vatican Gendarmerie. The building is equipped with state-of-the-art security systems, including biometric access control and 24-hour video surveillance. It is said that some particularly valuable documents are kept in safes equipped with self-destruction systems in case of attempted break-ins. But why such secrecy? The Vatican explains this by the need to protect fragile ancient documents and prevent their theft. However, critics point out that the same level of secrecy does not apply to other valuable historical documents in the archives. What is so special about these sealed manuscripts that the Church has guarded them for centuries? When, in the mid-20th century, scholars were first given limited access to some of the mysterious manuscripts, they were in for a shock. The texts were written in writing systems that had no analogues in any known culture. Initially, it was assumed that these were variants of forgotten ancient alphabets. But detailed analysis revealed something much stranger. Professor of linguistics Carlo Marchetti, one of the few who was able to study fragments of the manuscripts in the 1950s, described his experience as an encounter with a completely alien mind. The writing had an internal logic, but this logic did not correspond to the principles of any earthly language. The symbols repeated with a certain frequency, suggesting the presence of a grammatical structure, but it was not possible to decipher it. In total, the archives contain at least 17 manuscripts written in various unknown languages. Some of them are voluminous codices, others are individual sheets or fragments of scrolls. Radiocarbon analysis conducted in the 1980s showed that some of the documents are over 2,000 years old, while others date back to the Middle Ages. Particularly mysterious is a manuscript unofficially named the Codex Enoch. It consists of 183 pages, written in small handwriting in an unknown language. Each page contains illustrations, geometric patterns, astronomical diagrams, and images of creatures that resemble neither humans nor known animals. Computer analysis has shown that the text has a mathematical structure reminiscent of a code or cipher. Another manuscript, called the Hierophant Scroll, is a long papyrus rolled into a cylinder. Its writing resembles a mixture of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and Sumerian cuneiform. But upon closer inspection, it turns out to be a completely original system. Interestingly, the text is divided into sections by vertical lines with numerical designations using an unknown number system. Attempts to apply modern cryptanalysis methods to these texts have been unsuccessful. Computer programs capable of cracking the most complex ciphers are powerless against these manuscripts. This suggests that we are not dealing with a simple encryption of a known language, but with a truly unknown language system. Some researchers hypothesize that these texts may be written in the languages of extinct civilizations that left no other traces. Archaeological discoveries in recent decades show that human history is much more complex than previously thought. Perhaps there were advanced cultures that we know nothing about. Another theory links the manuscripts to secret religious movements of the early Christian era. It is known that Gnostics and other heretical groups used special ciphers and secret languages to protect their teachings from persecution. Perhaps some of these systems were so effective that they could not be deciphered even centuries later. There is also a more exotic hypothesis. Some researchers of paranormal phenomena suggest that the texts were obtained through mystical practices, automatic writing, trance, or other altered states of consciousness. There are known cases in history when people wrote texts in languages they did not know, claiming that they were receiving information from other realities. The Vatican officially calls these manuscripts objects of ongoing research. However, the fact remains that after decades of work, not a single line has been reliably translated. This either indicates the incredible complexity of the task or that the true results of the research are being kept secret. What secrets do these silent pages hide? Systematic attempts to decipher the mysterious manuscripts began in the mid-19th century. Pope Pius IX, known for his interest in science, allowed a group of Jesuit scholars to study several texts. The work was carried out in strict secrecy, and the results were never published. Only brief notes in the diaries of the project participants have survived. Father Giuseppe Marignelli, who led the research group, described his amazing observations in his letters. He noted that one of the manuscripts, called Liber Ignotus, the unknown book, contained repetitive structures resembling prayers or incantations. Some fragments of the text were accompanied by musical notation of an unknown type, which led the scientists to believe that the text was used in rituals. Marignelli's team compiled a frequency analysis of the symbols and attempted to apply the methods used by Jean-François Champollion in deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs. They looked for repetitive sequences that could correspond to names or frequently used words. However, all attempts came to a dead end. The project was shut down after 3 years of unsuccessful work. In the 1920s, British cryptographer Reginald Foster, who had worked on deciphering German codes during World War I, was given access to the manuscripts. His approach was more mathematical. Foster applied statistical methods and noticed a strange pattern. The entropy of the text, a measure of its randomness, was unusually low, which is typical for meaningful messages, but the distribution of symbols did not correspond to any known language. Foster hypothesized that the texts were written in an artificial, philosophical language, created for recording esoteric knowledge. There are similar attempts in history, for example, the language of John Wilkins in the 17th century. However, even this hypothesis did not help with the decryption. Moreover, Foster noticed that after prolonged study of the texts, he began to experience unexplained headaches and sleep disturbances. After World War II, cryptographers working on cracking the Enigma encryption machine joined the effort. A group led by Italian mathematician Aldo Castelli gained access to photocopies of 3 manuscripts. Using frequency analysis and statistical linguistics, they made several interesting discoveries. It turned out that the texts showed signs of natural language. Zipf's law, which describes the distribution of word frequencies, was observed with minor deviations. This means that we are not dealing with a random set of symbols or a simple substitution cipher. Castelli's team also found that some sequences of symbols only appear in certain contexts, which is characteristic of grammatical constructions. However, all attempts to establish the meanings of individual words or grammatical elements failed. Castelli wrote in his report, "We can see the structure of the language, just as we can see the skeleton of an unknown animal, but we cannot understand how it functioned when it was alive." In the 1970s, American linguist William Friedman, known for his work on deciphering Japanese military codes, was invited by the Vatican to serve as a consultant. He proposed a revolutionary approach at the time, using computers to analyze texts. Punch cards with character samples were compiled, and machine analysis was performed. The results puzzled Friedman. The computer revealed mathematical patterns that were impossible to notice during manual analysis. The text had a fractal structure. The same patterns were repeated at different levels, in words, sentences, and chapters. Such an organization is not found in ordinary languages, but is characteristic of some mathematical and musical compositions. Friedman suggested that the manuscripts might contain a multi-level message, text that could be read in different ways depending on the key. However, it was not possible to find this key. After a year of work, the project was closed, and Friedman was forbidden from publishing the results. Why did the Vatican decide to stop the research just when it was beginning to bear fruit? When it comes to unsolved manuscripts, the famous Voynich manuscript is the first that comes to mind. This mysterious 15th century book, written in an unknown language and richly illustrated with strange plants and astronomical diagrams, has remained undeciphered for decades. But few people know about its possible connection to the Vatican archives. The history of the manuscript can be traced back to the 16th century, when it belonged to Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, known for his interest in alchemy and the occult sciences. After his death, the book changed hands several times until it came into the possession of the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher. This is where the trail leads to the Vatican. Kircher was one of the greatest scholars of the 17th century, a polymath who studied everything from Egyptian hieroglyphics to volcanology. His collection of ancient manuscripts was legendary. After Kircher's death, most of his collection was transferred to the Vatican archives. However, the Voynich manuscript did not end up there. It disappeared for 2.5 centuries. This gave rise to the theory that copies of the manuscript or related documents are stored in the archives. Moreover, some researchers suggest that the Voynich manuscript is just one book in a series of similar texts, created by an unknown author or group of authors. The remaining volumes may be located in the sealed sections of the archives. In the 2000s, researcher René Sandbergen discovered a document in the Vatican Library, a 17th century letter mentioning a book in an unknown language with images of unseen plants. The description matches the Voynich manuscript exactly. The letter also mentions other similar books kept in the Pope's collection. Even more intriguing is the fact that the style of the illustrations in the Voynich manuscript is similar to the drawings in some other manuscripts from the Vatican, access to which is extremely limited. This refers to a specific technique for depicting plants and astronomical objects, the use of certain color pigments, and compositional solutions. Professor of art history Laura Fabrizi has suggested that the Voynich manuscript and the Vatican texts may originate from the same source, possibly a secret academy or esoteric school of the Middle Ages. Such communities existed in Renaissance Italy, bringing together scholars, alchemists, and mystics. They created coded texts to preserve knowledge that the Church might consider heretical. There is another version. According to it, the Voynich manuscript was created on the basis of an older text, a copy of which is kept in the Vatican. This prototype could have been written in the language of a lost civilization, or contain knowledge transmitted through mystical revelations. The author of the Voynich manuscript allegedly had access to the original and created his own version by adapting the text. Interestingly, attempts to decipher the Voynich manuscript face the same problems as working with Vatican texts. The language shows signs of a natural structure but cannot be deciphered. Computer analysis reveals patterns, but they do not correspond to known language models. Even the use of artificial intelligence has not yielded results. In 2018, a group of Canadian researchers claimed that they had partially deciphered the manuscript, identifying the language as coded Hebrew. However, their conclusions were criticized by the scientific community and have not been confirmed. The Vatican has not commented on this statement. The question remains: if the Voynich manuscript is indeed related to Vatican texts, why does the Church not provide access to documents that could help decipher it? Is the Vatican afraid of what might be discovered, or are there other reasons for keeping it secret? One of the most common theories about the content of the mysterious manuscripts is that they contain alternative religious teachings rejected by the official Church. In the early centuries of Christianity, there were many different movements, each with its own interpretation of Christ's teachings. Many of them were declared heresy and ruthlessly eradicated. Gnosticism was one of the most influential alternative movements in early Christianity. Gnostics believed in secret knowledge that Christ imparted only to his chosen disciples. They created an extensive body of literature, Gospels, Apocalypses, and secret books. Most of these texts were destroyed after Orthodox Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire. However, not all Gnostic texts were lost. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt in 1945 showed that some texts had survived. What if the Vatican archives contain even more important documents containing teachings that completely change our understanding of early Christianity? According to one theory, manuscripts in unknown languages may be Gnostic texts, encrypted to protect them from persecution. Gnostics are known for their penchant for secret writing and symbolism. They could have created a completely artificial language, or used an encryption system so complex that it cannot be deciphered even today. Of particular interest are the teachings related to the nature of Christ. The Orthodox Church asserts that Christ was both fully human and fully divine. However, many early Christian groups held different views. Some considered him a purely spiritual being, while others considered him an ordinary human being who became the bearer of divine power. If the manuscripts contain a detailed account of alternative Christologies, it could seriously shake the foundations of the faith of billions of people. Imagine if a text written by an eyewitness to the life of Christ were to be discovered that contradicted the canonical Gospels. Even if its authenticity is disputed, the very fact of its existence would spark endless debate. Another possibility is related to teachings about the origin of the world and the nature of evil. Gnostics held dualistic views, believing that the material world was the creation of an imperfect demiurge, not a benevolent God. Such ideas are radically different from the Judeo-Christian concept of creation and were declared heretical. There are also theories that the manuscripts may contain descriptions of rituals and practices used by early Christians. It is known that some Gnostic groups practiced complex ceremonies involving symbolic death and rebirth, spiritual journeys, and mystical revelations. Descriptions of these practices may have been so detailed that the Church deemed it necessary to hide them from the public. Interestingly, some Church historians acknowledge the existence of the problem. Cardinal Raphael Marzi, in an interview in 2010, hinted that the archives do indeed contain documents that could be misinterpreted by modern readers who do not have the proper theological education. Many took this statement as indirect confirmation of the existence of controversial texts. Contemporary theologians argue about how important it is for the Church to keep such documents secret. Some argue that faith must be based on truth, however uncomfortable it may be. Others believe that premature disclosure of complex theological issues could lead to schism and a crisis of faith among believers. But perhaps the contents of the manuscripts are even more unexpected. What if they describe a cosmology completely different from that of the Bible? Teachings about multiple levels of reality, the nature of time and space, the role of man in the universe. Such knowledge could change not only religious but also scientific worldviews. Is the world ready for such revelations? Among the most intriguing theories about the contents of the sealed manuscripts is the assumption that they describe ancient mystical practices and rituals. We are not talking about religious ceremonies, but about techniques for altering consciousness, spiritual journeys, and methods for achieving transcendent states known in various esoteric traditions. There are well-documented cases in the history of religions where sacred texts contained instructions for performing rituals that were considered too dangerous for the uninitiated. In the Jewish tradition, there is the concept of practical Kabbalah, mystical techniques that could only be practiced by specially trained sages. Similar restrictions existed in early Christianity. Apocryphal texts, such as the Book of Enoch, describe the patriarch's travels through the heavenly spheres and his encounters with angels who revealed secret knowledge to him. These narratives are not simply allegories. They may be descriptions of real mystical experiences achieved through special practices. Perhaps the manuscripts contain detailed instructions on how to achieve such states. Of particular interest is the connection between some manuscripts and astrological and astronomical diagrams. In ancient times, the distinction between astronomy and astrology was blurred, and the study of celestial bodies was closely intertwined with magical practices. It is known that many early Christian mystics used astral techniques for spiritual ascension. One of the manuscripts, according to descriptions by researchers who have seen it, contains detailed images of geometric shapes, mandalas, that could have been used for meditation. These patterns have a hypnotic effect, and prolonged contemplation of them can lead to altered states of consciousness. Similar techniques are known in various spiritual traditions, from Tibetan Buddhism to Islamic Sufism. There is evidence that some early Christian groups practiced rituals using sacred plants. Although the Church officially denies this, archaeological finds and texts point to the possible use of entheogens, psychoactive substances of natural origin, in a religious context. If manuscripts contain descriptions of such practices, it is not surprising that access to them is restricted. Another aspect that may be reflected in the texts is the practice of working with the body's energy. Many mystical traditions have techniques for controlling life force, prana, chi, pneuma. Early Christian literature mentions the spiritual body and methods of its development. Detailed instructions for such practices may have been recorded in manuscripts. Initiation rituals occupy a special place. In the mystery cults of antiquity, there were complex initiation ceremonies that included the symbolic death and rebirth of the initiate. Similar elements are present in early Christianity. Baptism was seen as the death of the old person and the birth of the new. However, there may have been deeper levels of initiation described in secret texts. Professor of comparative religion Marco Theodolini has suggested that some manuscripts may be grimoires, books of magic spells and rituals. Although the Church officially condemns magic, the line between prayer and incantation, between miracle and magic, has always been blurred. Early Christians may have used techniques that would be classified as magical today. There are also theories that the manuscripts describe methods of predicting the future. Prophecy played an important role in early Christianity, and the ability to receive divine revelations was considered a sign of holiness. Techniques for achieving a prophetic trance may have included prayer practices, fasting, and other methods of altering consciousness. Finally, it cannot be ruled out that the texts contain descriptions of theurgical practices, rituals for invoking divine powers. In the Neoplatonic tradition, which influenced early Christianity, theurgy was considered the highest form of spiritual practice. Perhaps some Christian mystics developed their own theurgical systems, knowledge of which the Church deemed necessary to conceal. What power can these ancient techniques give to those who master them? The history of attempts to study these mysterious manuscripts is full of dramatic episodes. Many researchers who showed excessive interest in these texts encountered obstacles that put an end to their careers. Official explanations were always found, but the pattern is too obvious to be coincidental. One of the first high-profile cases was the story of French paleographer Jean-Luc Dupont. In 1963, he received permission to work in the Vatican archives to study medieval manuscripts. Stumbling upon a reference to texts in unknown languages, Dupont submitted a request to study them. The request was denied without explanation. Dupont did not give up. He began to study indirect sources, letters, catalogs, references in other documents. Gradually, he managed to gather information about several manuscripts. However, when he tried to publish an article with the results of his research, the publication refused him on the recommendation of an unnamed reviewer. Shortly thereafter, Dupont lost access to the archives completely. A similar fate befell Italian linguist Elena Rossi. A specialist in ancient Semitic languages, she was invited to the Vatican as a consultant to decipher fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls found in Qumran. While working, she was shown a fragment of one of the mysterious manuscripts for comparison. Rossi noticed a certain similarity in the style of writing. Intrigued, she asked for permission to study the manuscript in more detail. Permission was granted, but on condition of strict confidentiality. Rossi worked with the text for several months, taking notes and photographs. She was confident that she was close to a breakthrough when her contract was suddenly terminated. All her materials were confiscated, and she signed a non-disclosure agreement under threat of legal action. Rossi violated the agreement only once, in a private conversation with a colleague who later passed on her words to journalists. She said that the manuscript contained descriptions that should not have existed at the time the text was written. What exactly she meant remains unknown. Shortly after that interview, Rossi refused to make any further public statements on the subject. American researcher David Morgan encountered an even stranger situation. A cryptography specialist, he was invited by the Vatican to consult on a decryption problem in 2000. Morgan applied the latest computer methods and obtained intriguing results. However, before he could complete his work, the project was suddenly shut down. Morgan returned to the United States, but soon discovered that his email had been hacked and a computer hard drive containing copies of his materials had been stolen from his office. Going to the police yielded no results. The investigation reached a dead end. After that, Morgan received an offer for a high-paying job at a private company, on the condition that he would no longer work on Vatican manuscripts. Not all stories end so relatively happily. Spanish historian Miguel Sanchez, who studied the links between manuscripts and medieval heresies, died in a car accident under mysterious circumstances. The investigation showed that his car's brake system was faulty, but experts were unable to determine whether this was due to wear and tear or sabotage. Interestingly, obstacles are not only created by church structures. Researchers report problems with obtaining grants, publishing articles, and receiving invitations to conferences. One gets the impression that there is an unspoken list of topics that are highly undesirable for an academic career. Manuscripts in unknown languages are definitely on this list. Modern scholars who want to study these texts are forced to act with extreme caution. Some prefer to work anonymously, using pseudonyms when publishing their results on the internet. Others study the problem indirectly, through the analysis of similar texts from available sources. But direct access to the Vatican manuscripts remains virtually impossible. The question arises: if the texts are really only of historical or linguistic interest, why guard them so carefully from researchers? Why are scholars who show interest in them systematically removed from their work? Does this not indicate that the content of the manuscripts is so important and potentially destructive that any risk of their disclosure must be ruled out? One of the most enduring legends associated with the Vatican manuscripts concerns prophecies. It is claimed that some texts contain predictions of future events that are so accurate and detailed that their disclosure could cause panic and social upheaval. It sounds like a conspiracy theory fantasy, but there is circumstantial evidence that deserves attention. The Catholic Church has a complex relationship with prophecies. On the one hand, biblical prophets are revered as saints, but on the other, the Church is extremely cautious about new revelations. History knows many cases when prophecies were recognized as false or demonic. The criteria for distinguishing between true and false prophecies have always been the subject of theological debate. In 1917, the famous apparition of the Virgin Mary to 3 Portuguese children took place in Fatima. The Virgin Mary allegedly revealed 3 secrets to them. The first 2 were eventually disclosed, while the third was kept secret until the year 2000. When it was finally made public, many believed that the Church had revealed only part of the information, concealing the most disturbing details. This case set a precedent and showed that the Vatican is prepared to classify prophetic information that it considers premature or dangerous to disclose. If this is the case with relatively recent revelations, what can be said about ancient texts that may contain prophecies of a much more radical nature? According to insider information, one of the manuscripts, called the Book of Dates, contains a timeline of historical events stretching from the moment the text was created to some final point. The verifiable events of the past described in it demonstrate remarkable accuracy. If this accuracy is extrapolated to the future, a very disturbing picture emerges. Of particular interest are the prophecies concerning the fate of the Church itself. Throughout the history of Christianity, there have been many predictions about future trials, schisms, and revivals of the Church. The most famous are the prophecies of Saint Malachy about the popes, a list attributed to a 12th century Irish archbishop who supposedly predicted all the Roman popes until the end of time. Although the authenticity of Malachy's prophecies is disputed, the very fact of their existence shows an interest in eschatological issues. If the Vatican manuscripts contain similar but more detailed prophecies about the future of the Church, including possible crises or transformations, it is understandable why the hierarchy would be reluctant to make them public. Another aspect relates to global cataclysms. Many ancient texts contain descriptions of cosmic cycles, periodic catastrophes, and renewals of the world. If the manuscripts include a calendar of such events with specific dates, this could cause serious concern. Even if the probability of such prophecies coming true is low, the very fact of their existence could be a source of social instability. There are also theories about prophecies of a technological nature. Some ancient texts contain descriptions that can be interpreted as foresight of future inventions. If the manuscripts describe technologies that have not yet been created, this calls into question our understanding of the nature of time and the possibility of obtaining information about the future. Professor of philosophy Antonio Galvani has offered an interesting interpretation. In his opinion, the prophecies in the manuscripts may not be predictions in the usual sense, but descriptions of archetypal patterns of civilization development. Understanding these patterns could provide the key to predicting the future, but also to changing it. Perhaps this is precisely what the Vatican fears, that knowledge of the mechanisms of historical development could be used to manipulate the future. Finally, there is a theory that some prophecies have already come true, but their connection to the manuscripts is carefully concealed. If it is proven that an ancient text accurately predicted specific historical events, it would raise uncomfortable questions about the nature of time, free will, and the possibility of transcendent forces intervening in human history. The Church officially claims that all necessary revelations have already been given in Scripture, and that no additional prophecies are needed for salvation. But if this is the case, why are texts that may contain such additional revelations so carefully guarded? Is the Vatican afraid that these prophecies will turn out to be true, or conversely, that they will be exposed as false? What if the history of Christianity that we know is just one of many versions that prevailed as a result of historical accidents and political decisions? This hypothesis is finding more and more confirmation, and manuscripts in unknown languages may contain evidence of those versions of Christianity that lost the struggle for dominance. In the first 3 centuries of its existence, Christianity was an incredibly diverse movement. Different communities had their own sacred texts and their own interpretations of Christ's teachings. What we call Orthodox Christianity was only one of the directions that became dominant due to political and social factors. The process of forming the New Testament canon stretched over centuries. Many texts that were revered as sacred were rejected by other communities. The final list was only established in the 4th century. What happened to the texts that were not included in the canon? Many were destroyed, but some may have been preserved in archives. Of particular interest are the Judeo-Christian communities, groups that considered themselves both Jews and followers of Christ. They observed Jewish law but recognized Jesus as the Messiah. Their interpretation differed radically from the prevailing one. Only fragments of the Gospels of these communities have survived. But what if the complete texts did not disappear, but were classified? Docetism, the doctrine of the phantom body of Christ, denied physical incarnation and suffering. Although it was declared heresy, it had a significant influence. The docetic texts may have contained a different version of the gospel story, where the crucifixion was a mystical drama rather than a real event. Such a version would undermine the foundations of Christian soteriology. There were also some exotic variations. The Carpocratians believed in reincarnation. The Ophites revered the serpent as a bearer of knowledge. The Cainites considered Judas a hero. Although these groups were marginal, their texts may have contained unique theological concepts. Texts related to the feminine principle in Christianity occupy a special place. It is known that some early communities revered Mary Magdalene as equal to or even superior to the apostles. The Gnostic Gospel of Mary depicts her as the recipient of secret revelations from Christ. If the manuscripts contain more complete versions of such texts, this could completely change our understanding of the role of women in early Christianity. The question of authority is also important. The structure of the church hierarchy, the role of bishops and popes, all of this developed gradually and was not originally established. Some early communities were more democratic, others more charismatic. Texts describing alternative models of church organization could provide a basis for criticism of the modern church structure. Finally, it is possible that the manuscripts contain versions of gospel events recorded by people who witnessed them, but whose testimonies were not included in the canon. Imagine a text written by someone in Jesus' family or his closest disciples, containing details that contradict the canonical Gospels. Even if its historical authenticity is debatable, its very existence would create insoluble theological dilemmas. The Vatican claims that the canon of sacred scripture is divinely inspired and cannot be changed. But the discovery of alternative texts would force a re-examination of the criteria for divine inspiration. Why were some texts recognized as sacred and others rejected? Was this a political rather than a spiritual decision? The art of concealing information existed long before the advent of modern cryptography. Ancient civilizations developed sophisticated methods of protecting secrets, from simple substitution ciphers to complex multi-level coding systems. Manuscripts in unknown languages may represent the pinnacle of ancient cryptographic art, a system so perfect that it remains undeciphered centuries later. One of the oldest forms of encryption is atbash, which was used in Hebrew. Each letter of the alphabet was replaced with its opposite, the first with the last, the second with the second to last, and so on. This method is even found in biblical texts. But atbash was only the beginning. Jewish mystics developed much more complex systems, such as gematria and temura. Gematria was based on the numerical values of letters. Each letter corresponded to a number, and words with the same sum were considered mystically related. Using gematria, it was possible to create texts with multiple levels of meaning, superficial and hidden. Perhaps the manuscripts use a similar system, but based on an alphabet unknown to us. Greek philosophers and mathematicians also contributed to cryptography. Polybius invented the Polybius square, a table for converting letters into numerical pairs. This system was simple but effective. Its modifications were used until the 20th century. If manuscripts use multi-layered encryption, where the text in an unknown language is only the first level, and additional messages are hidden beneath it through numerical codes, decryption becomes almost impossible without a key. Medieval alchemists were famous for their ability to conceal knowledge. Alchemical texts are written in a language of symbols and allegories that only the initiated can understand. Descriptions of chemical processes were disguised as mythological narratives. The philosopher's stone could mean a real substance, spiritual enlightenment, or a mathematical formula. It all depended on the reader's level of initiation. Steganography, the art of concealing the very fact of a message's existence, was well known in ancient times. Herodotus describes a case where a message was shaved onto a slave's head. Then the hair grew back, and the slave went to the recipient, who shaved his head again to read the text. Manuscripts may contain steganographic elements, hidden messages in illustrations, in the arrangement of lines, in the choice of ink colors. Of particular interest are acrostics and telestics, texts where the first or last letters of lines form a hidden message. This technique was used in religious poetry. Some psalms in the Bible are acrostics in Hebrew. If manuscripts use similar methods but in an unknown language, it is extremely difficult to discover the hidden message without understanding the basic text. Notarikon is a Kabbalistic technique where each letter of a word represents an entire word, turning a short phrase into a long text or vice versa. This creates an incredibly compact way of recording information. A 100-page manuscript encoded with Notarikon could contain information equivalent to thousands of pages of regular text. Medieval Arab mathematicians developed frequency analysis, a method of breaking substitution ciphers by studying the frequency of symbols. Al-Kindi wrote a treatise on cryptanalysis in the 9th century, in which he described this technique. However, if manuscripts use a polyalphabetic cipher, where one letter can be encoded by different symbols depending on its position, frequency analysis becomes ineffective. The Vigenère cipher, invented in the 16th century, was considered unbreakable for several centuries. It used a keyword to select one of many replacement alphabets. Without knowing the key, decryption was virtually impossible. If the creators of the manuscripts used a similar principle, but with a much longer key, or a key that changed according to a complex algorithm, cracking it may be impossible even with modern computers. There is a theory that some manuscripts may have been written in artificial languages created specifically for recording esoteric knowledge. Unlike natural languages, which developed organically, an artificial language can be designed with cryptographic principles in mind. Each element of grammar and vocabulary would serve not only for communication, but also for protecting information. Modern cryptographers recognize that even with the use of quantum computers, some types of encryption remain theoretically unbreakable. A one-time pad, where the key is the same length as the message and is used only once, ensures absolute secrecy. If the creators of the manuscripts used something similar, the secret may remain undisclosed forever, unless the key is found. But where to look for the key to texts that are thousands of years old? History has many references to mysterious texts that were incomprehensible to contemporaries. Some of these references may refer to manuscripts now stored in the Vatican archives. By tracing these historical clues, we can piece together an indirect picture of what these documents are and why they have been of such interest for centuries. In the 5th century, St. Augustine mentions in his writings certain books in a language that is neither Greek nor Latin nor Hebrew nor any of the known barbarian dialects. He writes that he saw these books in his youth in Carthage and that they contained knowledge that is not intended for the uninitiated. Augustine does not provide details, but this fragment intrigues researchers. Medieval chronicles mention the Books of Solomon, which supposedly contain the secret wisdom of the legendary king. These books were different from the well-known biblical texts attributed to Solomon. According to legend, King Solomon had power over demons and knew the secrets of nature. His magical books were sought after by alchemists and occultists for centuries. One medieval text describes how, after the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders discovered a sealed box with ancient scrolls in the ruins of the temple. The chronicle reports that the scrolls were sent to Rome, but their language proved incomprehensible. Could these be the very manuscripts that are now kept in the archives? The Templars, a military order of crusaders, were accused of heresy and possession of secret knowledge. When they were defeated in the early 14th century, numerous documents were confiscated. Most were destroyed, but some fell into the hands of Pope Clement V. The inventory of the Templars' property mentions books in unknown languages with mysterious symbols. The trail of these books leads to Avignon, where the papal throne was located at the time, and from there to the Vatican. Giordano Bruno, executed by the Inquisition in 1600, mentioned in his works ancient texts containing the true philosophy that the Church hides from people. Bruno claimed that he had seen fragments of these texts, and that they confirmed his cosmological ideas about the infinity of the universe and the multiplicity of worlds. Were these the very same manuscripts? Of particular interest are the notes of the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, a famous 17th-century scholar. Kircher had access to the Vatican collections and left descriptions of several books in unknown languages. He attempted to decipher them, using his knowledge of Egyptian hieroglyphs and other ancient scripts, but failed. Kircher noted that these texts have an internal logic, but this logic is alien to the human mind. In the 18th century, Count Cagliostro, a famous adventurer and occultist, claimed to have been initiated into secret knowledge after studying an ancient manuscript in the Vatican. According to him, this text contained the keys to alchemical transmutations and communication with spiritual entities. Cagliostro was exposed as a charlatan, but his connections with the Vatican are documented. In the 19th century, French occultist Eliphas Lévy wrote about a great magical book kept in the secret sections of the Vatican Library. Lévy claimed that this book was written in a language that was the universal key to all the mysteries of nature. He described a complex system of correspondences between letters, numbers, astrological symbols, and natural forces. Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical movement, refers in her secret doctrine to the stanzas of Dizian, supposedly the oldest text of humanity, preserved in Tibetan monasteries. However, some researchers believe that she may have had access to information about Vatican manuscripts through her contacts in Italy. The descriptions of the stanzas are remarkably similar to descriptions of unknown texts from the archives. In the 20th century, Swiss psychologist Carl Jung was interested in alchemical manuscripts and attended Vatican meetings. In his later works, he mentions texts that seem to have been generated by the collective unconscious rather than by an individual author. Jung suggested that some ancient texts may have been written by people in altered states of consciousness, which explains their strange structure. All this evidence, scattered and separated by centuries, paints a picture that points to the existence of a body of mysterious texts that have constantly attracted the attention of mystics, scholars, and seekers of secret knowledge. What has made these texts so compelling for millennia? The 21st century has brought revolutionary technologies that offer hope for deciphering even the most complex ancient texts. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computers. These tools are already being applied to ancient languages with impressive results. But why do the Vatican manuscripts remain unread? In 2016, a group of researchers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology developed a machine learning algorithm to decipher lost languages. The system analyzes the structural patterns of an unknown language and searches for matches with known languages. The method was successfully applied to the Ugaritic language, demonstrating high accuracy. This breakthrough sparked a wave of optimism. It seemed that a tool for deciphering manuscripts in unknown languages had finally appeared. Several research groups approached the Vatican with a proposal to apply new technologies to the mysterious texts. However, they were all rejected on the grounds that the documents are too fragile to work with. In reality, modern technologies allow ancient texts to be studied without physical contact. Multispectral imaging reveals faded or worn inscriptions. X-ray fluorescence determines the composition of the ink. Three-dimensional scanning creates high-resolution digital copies. All of these methods are non-invasive and safe for the documents. So why does the Vatican not allow their use? Quantum computers, which began to be used in practice in the 2020s, have computing power that is incomparable to classical computers. They are capable of solving cryptographic problems that were previously considered unsolvable. If the manuscripts are complex ciphers, quantum systems could crack them in a reasonable amount of time. A group of cryptographers from the University of Zurich proposed a partnership with the Vatican in 2022. They wanted to apply quantum algorithms to digital copies of the manuscripts, guaranteeing complete confidentiality of the results. The Vatican rejected the proposal without explanation. This suggests that the problem is not technical capabilities, but a reluctance to disclose the content of the texts. Neural networks trained on large text corpora demonstrate an amazing ability to recognize language patterns. The GPT system has shown the ability to generate coherent text in dozens of languages, even those in which it has received only limited training. In theory, a neural network could detect patterns in manuscripts that are invisible to humans. The Decipherer Project, an international initiative launched in 2023, brought together linguists, mathematicians, and artificial intelligence specialists. Their goal is to create a universal system for deciphering lost and unknown languages. The team approached the Vatican with a request for access to the manuscripts, offering complete transparency of the process and joint management of the results. No response was received. Crowdsourcing, involving the general public in solving problems, has proven its effectiveness in scientific research. Platforms such as Zooniverse have allowed thousands of volunteers to contribute to the deciphering of ancient texts. If digital copies of the manuscripts were made publicly available, an army of enthusiasts around the world could work on deciphering them. But the Vatican is categorically opposed to this approach. Interestingly, the Church does not reject technology entirely. Modern cataloging and document preservation systems have been implemented in the archives. Some texts have been digitized and are available online, but it is precisely the mysterious manuscripts that remain outside any digitization programs. This selective use of technology points to a deliberate policy of secrecy. There is a theory that the Vatican has already applied modern technology to the manuscripts in secret. Perhaps the texts have been deciphered, but the results have been classified. This would explain why the Church so confidently refuses outside researchers. They already know what is written there, and do not want it to become public knowledge. Another version suggests that modern technology has indeed been applied, but without success. Perhaps the manuscripts use coding principles so advanced that even artificial intelligence and quantum computers are powerless. This would mean that the creators of the texts possessed knowledge beyond our current capabilities. But who could have created such texts thousands of years ago? And where did they get such a deep understanding of mathematics and cryptography? What would happen if the contents of the manuscripts were made public? The Vatican claims that disclosure could cause a spiritual crisis of unprecedented proportions. This statement sounds dramatic, but how justified is it? What information could shake the faith of billions of people? History has examples of new discoveries that have indeed caused crises of worldview. Copernicus's heliocentric system destroyed the idea of the Earth as the center of the universe. Darwin's theory of evolution called into question the literal interpretation of the biblical account of creation. Each of these discoveries was met with fierce resistance from the Church, but was ultimately accepted. Modern society is more secular and scientifically oriented than in past eras. One might assume that it would be more receptive to information that contradicts traditional beliefs. However, religion remains a crucial element of identity for billions of people. Information that undermines the foundations of faith can indeed have serious consequences. Imagine that the manuscripts contain evidence that key events in the Gospel story happened differently than described in the canonical texts, or that Christ's teachings were significantly distorted in the formation of orthodox doctrine. For believers, this would mean that their entire spiritual life was built on incomplete or distorted information. The psychological impact of such a discovery would be difficult to overestimate. Faith gives people a sense of purpose, moral guidance, and comfort in the face of suffering and death. The sudden destruction of this foundation could lead to an existential crisis on an individual level and to social upheaval on a societal level. Historical examples show how religious crises lead to conflict. The Reformation of the 16th century, triggered by criticism of the practices of the Catholic Church, led to religious wars that devastated Europe. What if the disclosure of the contents of the manuscripts provokes a new schism in Christianity, but one that is much deeper? There is also a risk that the information will be used by destructive forces. Radical groups may interpret ancient texts in support of their extremist ideologies. Anti-religious movements will gain a powerful weapon to discredit faith. Geopolitical opponents of the Christian world will take advantage of the crisis to advance their interests. On the other hand, many theologians and philosophers argue that true faith should not fear the truth. If Christianity is based on real events and true principles, no discoveries can destroy it. On the contrary, an honest confrontation with uncomfortable facts can lead to a more mature and deeper understanding of faith. Moreover, withholding information in itself undermines trust in the Church. In an age of information openness, secrecy looks suspicious. The younger generation, accustomed to the accessibility of information, is distrustful of institutions that hide knowledge. Continuing the policy of secrecy may prove more damaging to the Church's authority than revealing its secrets. Professor of Sociology of Religion Anna Martinelli offers an alternative interpretation. In her opinion, the Vatican overestimates the risks and underestimates people's ability to adapt to new information. Contemporary religious consciousness has already undergone many transformations and proven its flexibility. The disclosure of the manuscripts would lead to a rethinking of tradition. but not necessarily to its collapse. There is another perspective. Perhaps the manuscripts contain not so much a refutation of Christianity as an expansion of its boundaries. Knowledge of mystical practices, alternative cosmologies, and forgotten teachings could enrich contemporary spirituality. The crisis would not be destructive, but transformative, leading to a new synthesis. But the Vatican, by all accounts, is not ready to take the risk. An institution that has existed for 2,000 years thinks in terms of centuries and millennia. From its point of view, the short-term benefits of openness are not worth the long-term risks to the stability of faith. Perhaps the Church is right to protect humanity from knowledge for which it is not ready. Or is this paternalism, depriving people of the right to decide for themselves what truth they are ready to face? We have come a long way in researching the mystery of the Vatican manuscripts. We have examined the history of the archives, attempts at deciphering them, theories about their contents, evidence from the past, modern technology, and the possible consequences of disclosure. Now it is time to ask the main question. What is really hidden behind this centuries-old silence? Perhaps the truth will turn out to be more prosaic than conspiracy theories. The manuscripts may simply be very old texts, in languages that were not widely spoken even in their own time, and have completely disappeared without leaving any other traces. Their content may be mundane: trade records, personal correspondence, literary works of no particular significance. But if so, why the persistent secrecy? The Vatican publishes many ancient documents that have no religious significance. The archives are open to researchers who want to study medieval financial reports or diplomatic correspondence. What makes these manuscripts so special that access to them is completely closed? Let's return to the main theories. The first is that the manuscripts contain alternative religious teachings that contradict orthodoxy. This would explain the secrecy. The Church fears that the texts could be used to undermine its authority. However, in the modern world, there are many alternative interpretations of Christianity, and the Church has learned to coexist with them. The second theory is that the texts describe mystical practices and rituals. Here, the argument for secrecy is stronger. The Church may fear that people without proper training will attempt to practice the techniques described, leading to negative consequences. History knows of cases where occult practices have had a devastating effect on the psyche. The third theory is that the manuscripts contain prophecies. This is perhaps the most convincing explanation for the secrecy. Even if the likelihood of the prophecies coming true is doubtful, their publication could cause panic, self-fulfilling prophecies, and social instability. History shows how apocalyptic expectations have led to mass movements and tragedies. The fourth theory is that the texts provide an alternative version of history, including the history of Christianity. This touches on the question of identity. If it turns out that the history on which modern civilization is based differs significantly from actual events, it would undermine the foundations of culture. The Vatican may believe that humanity is not ready for such a revision. The fifth theory, the most radical, suggests that the manuscripts contain knowledge of extraterrestrial origin, or describe contact with other forms of intelligence. This idea is generally rejected by academic science, but it would explain why the texts are impossible to decipher and why secrecy is so absolute. Perhaps the truth includes elements of all these theories. The manuscripts may be a collection of diverse texts, each problematic in its own way. Some contain alternative religious teachings, others mystical practices, others prophecies, and still others unexpected historical evidence. There is another possibility. The Vatican itself does not fully understand what the manuscripts contain. Perhaps attempts at deciphering them have yielded only fragmentary results, sufficient to understand that full disclosure is dangerous, but insufficient for a complete understanding of the content. In this situation, secrecy becomes a precautionary measure in the face of the unknown. The irony of the situation is that secrecy itself gives rise to legends and theories that can be more destructive than reality. The lack of information is filled with speculation, often exaggerating the significance of what is being hidden. Perhaps the disclosure of the manuscripts would disappoint conspiracy theorists by showing that the truth is less dramatic than they had imagined. But what if not? What if the content is so revolutionary that its disclosure would change the world? In that case, we are faced with a fundamental question. Does some knowledge have the right to remain hidden? Are there truths from which society should be protected? Philosophers have debated the right to knowledge and the responsibility that comes with it for centuries. Ancient mystery cults believed that secret teaching should only be passed on to the initiated. Plato, in his 7th letter, writes that some truths cannot be written down. Modern democratic ethics, on the contrary, asserts the right to information as fundamental. The mystery of the Vatican manuscripts remains unsolved. Perhaps someday a new generation of church hierarchs will decide to open the archives. Perhaps technological progress will make secrecy impossible. Or perhaps the mystery will remain for centuries to come, continuing to stir the imagination of seekers of truth. Are you ready for answers that could overturn everything you believed in?